Zusha. Aren't they great? They once did a show here. We did a live show on Accidental Talmudist in our backyard. They were on our back balcony of our house, for an hour and a half, just playing songs and talking and sharing Torah. Phenomenal band. That's Zusha. The album is called Kavana, and that song was Mashiach. How's everybody doing? That was dull. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to do a little beautiful learning on Erev Shabbos? We're getting ready for Shabbos. It's getting earlier and earlier and earlier as we approach the winter. And when the clocks change this Saturday night, in case you didn't remember, this Saturday night into Sunday, fall back 1 hour. We turn the clocks back 1 hour, get an extra hour of sleep. And after that, Shabbos is going to start really early on Friday evenings. And today is also Rosh Chodesh. We've been talking so much about the Sanhedrin sanctifying the new moon, a new month, a new Hebrew month. Today we begin the new Hebrew month of Kislev, the month of miracles. Thank God we're in Kislev. Called the month of miracles because it has Hanukkah in it, the celebration of a miracle. Who is with us as we get together to do some learning? Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Bill in mid-Missouri. James in Indianapolis. Yehudit. Wishing everyone a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Paula in Chicago. Guy in Ohio. Stephen in New Hampshire. Tom, wishing everyone a good Shabbos. Hannah in New York. Sharon will be watching on replay. Having a washing machine disaster, and she's in Home Depot. Good Shabbos. You should get the machine that you were always destined to have, and it should give you no more problems. We live in such a time, so often we get flustered. Today, I got flustered because a machine didn't work, and I couldn't find the batteries, and suddenly it's so annoying, I'm so angry, it's so I needed to learn the lesson today to just be a little bit more relaxed, and I shouldn't have snapped at Nina when I was annoyed. Had nothing to do with her, and I apologize, Nina. I was sorry I was short-tempered. Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom in Philadelphia, Lisa in Arlington, Massachusetts, Randy in Palm Springs. And everybody having a conversation. Beautiful. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Hi, I'm wishing us good Shabbos. And Paula says, amen, I know that feeling. Over there on the YouTube side, Hanako says, hi from Florida. Welcome. All right. Where are we holding? This is page 27 here in Tractate Rosh Hashana, the 9th volume of the Talmud. We're getting near the end. There's only 35 pages. We're on 27, 8 days away. We are in chapter 3. Today we'll be discussing Mishnahs 3 and 4 of chapter 3. And after so much discussing of the calendar and how the calendar works and which are the days of the year, the new day, the days that mark a new year for different purposes, and how the Sanhedrin sanctified the new month, etc., now we're talking about the observance of Rosh Hashanah itself from the perspective of the shofar blasts of Rosh Hashanah. What is a kosher shofar? What isn't? What is a kosher shofar blast? And what isn't? We pick it up right at the top of the A side of page 27. It was taught in the Mishnah, and the mouth of the shofar that was used on Rosh Hashanah was plated with gold. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. But isn't it taught in a Baraisa, if a shofar was plated with gold at the place where one puts his mouth? So we're imagining here, this is a ram's horn shofar. This is the place where one puts his mouth. And they're saying that the one that was used in the temple had some gold right at the mouthpiece. But we have a different baraisa which says that if the mouthpiece actually had gold on it, then that shofar was pasul. It was rendered unfit for use, disqualified. So which is it? They couldn't use a disqualified shofar when the Holy Temple was standing. So what are we to make of this contradiction? If there was gold at the place where one puts his mouth, it is unfit for blowing. If it was plated, but not at the place where he puts his mouth, it is fit for blowing. And Abaye said, when we learned in the Mishna as well, we learned that it referred not to the place where one puts his mouth, but a little above it. So if they wrapped some gold leaf around the shofar, and I've seen many shofars like this, mine don't have it, but you can find shofars that have kind of strips of silver or of gold around them, but not right at the end where the mouth goes, nor right at the very end where the sound comes out. It's more decorative strips of silver or gold along the passage of the shofar. It was taught in the Mishnah, and there were 2 trumpets, one on each of the 2 sides of the person sounding the shofar. Now, when we talk about these trumpets, you've seen these in kind of movies and paintings of antiquity. When they're talking about the trumpets, they're talking about metal trumpets, not with valves like a jazz trumpet player would have, but just one straight long metal tube with a bell at the end and a mouthpiece. Could be made of silver, could be made of gold, but it was a metallic trumpet. We used those in the desert as well. There were blasts of the trumpets to tell people, to tell the encampment to go, it's time to get moving, etc. And that was done with trumpets. In the temple also, they used trumpets. And as we learned yesterday, when there was a public fast day, the mitzvah of announcing the fast day was done with the trumpet, usually a silver trumpet. But of course, the mitzvah of Rosh Hashana and of Yom Kippur is to hear a shofar. And we learned yesterday a shofar could be made of any animal horn that is hollow in its natural state, except the horn of a cow or a bull, because that is inappropriate since we had the sin of the golden calf at Mount Sinai. Okay, so it's taught in the Mishnah that there were 2 trumpets, one on each of the 2 sides of the person sounding the shofar. And the Gemara asks, but is it really possible to properly discern 2 different sounds, that of the shofar and that of the trumpets, at the same time? Isn't it taught in a baraisa the 2 versions of... Now here it says the 2 versions of the 5th of the 10 commandments, remember the Shabbos day and keep the Shabbos day, Shamor v'Zachor, or in this case, Zachor v'Shamor. So first of all, the commandment to keep Shabbos is the 4th commandment, not the 5th. So that's just a misprint here in this edition of the Talmud. The 5th commandment of the 10 commandments is honor thy father and thy mother, which is interesting because the first tablet describes the obligations of a person toward God, and the second tablet describes the obligations of a person toward other people. Honoring one's father and mother is actually a way of honoring God, and that's why it's found on the first tablet as the 5th commandment. But at any rate, the 4th commandment of the 10 commandments is about keeping Shabbos or remembering Shabbos. The 10 commandments are written twice in the Torah, when they were given and when they were recalled in the book of Deuteronomy toward the end of his life, when Moses is recounting for all the children of Israel who are on the edge of the Holy Land about to enter. Moses won't be able to enter with them. He's giving them a long, long discourse, all the lessons that were learned during their 2 years, what's contained in the Torah, what the people should keep in mind as they go into the promised land. And he recounts the 10 commandments, and when he does so, in Deuteronomy, it says, keep the Shabbos day, Shamor Shabbos. And when it was initially given in the book of Exodus, it says Zachor Shabbos, right? To remember the Sabbath day. And our sages have taught elsewhere, what is the difference between keeping Shabbos and remembering Shabbos? I think keeping Shabbos is making sure not to do all the things that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Remembering Shabbos is to do the positive commandments that we do on Shabbos, like making Kiddush and women lighting candles. And that's generally the difference between them. But the point is that they were spoken in different ways in different times. And then the question is, well, what was Moses doing when he reiterated the Ten Commandments in that final sermon on the edge of the Holy Land? Did he misquote the Ten Commandments as they were originally given? And our sages say, actually, no. What does it say here? The two versions of the Ten Commandments, remember the Shabbos day and keep the Shabbos day, were spoken by God simultaneously in a single utterance, something that the human mouth cannot speak and the human ear cannot hear. This indicates that it is impossible to take in two sounds at once. God could say both shamor v'zachor. He could say both remember and keep at the same time. And I suppose if God says it, then the people could hear it and perceive it and understand it. Although, God didn't actually speak all 10 commandments. God spoke the first commandment, maybe the second, and then the people were like, it's too much, it's too overwhelming, our souls are going to fly out of our bodies. Moses, you go and listen to the 10 commandments and all the other commandments, and then you, a human being, repeat them to us, because it's too overwhelming to have this God experience. So presumably when God said to Moses that you will remember and keep the Sabbath day, he said it at the same time. Moses heard both versions and then reported both versions to the people. But this is being used as a source for the idea, and I'll tell you, the older I get, the more I identify with this. When I have two people speaking at the same time, there's no way I can understand what both of them are saying. I don't think anybody can really understand two people speaking to them at once. But as we get older, it gets like highly irritating to hear interference because our hearing suffers, right? Like when you're young, you can have a conversation with your friend in the middle of a crowded room where lots of people are talking, and you can clearly understand what your friend is saying. As you get older, it gets harder and harder to discern clearly what people are saying when there's a lot of background noise. At any rate, the teaching here is that if the shofar and the trumpets are sounding at the same time, well, then you haven't heard the shofar blast clearly, and that is the commandment to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana and on Yom Kippur. So if the trumpets are sounding at the same time, how can you say you have fulfilled your obligation? That's the question they're asking. And the Gemara answers, for this reason, they would sound a long blast of the shofar to make it possible to hear the sound of the shofar on its own. And the Gemara rejects this answer. Is this to say that if one hears the end of a blast without hearing the beginning of the blast, he has fulfilled his obligation? Are you saying that what they did in the temple, when the temple was standing, that's when they blew the shofar on Rosh Hashana accompanied by trumpets? As we'll learn later today, the trumpets were no longer used after the temple was destroyed. But is this to say that when the temple was standing, did the trumpets and the shofar start their blast at the same time, and then the trumpets made a short blast, so they ended early, and then the shofar kept sounding, and therefore people fulfill their obligation by hearing the second half or the later part of the shofar blast, even though the first part of the shofar blast was not clearly discernible because it was accompanied by the trumpets at the same time? Is that what you're saying? That's how they fulfill their obligation? Wait a minute, where was I? In this case, one hears only the end of the shofar blast since the shofar was initially sounded together with the trumpets. If so, it would follow that if one hears the beginning of the blast without hearing the end of the blast, he has also fulfilled his obligation. Like if you came in late to synagogue on Rosh Hashana and the shofar blower had already started sounding the blast, and you came in and heard the latter part of it, but you didn't hear the beginning, did you fulfill your obligation? If they fulfilled it in the days of the temple by hearing, because the shofar blast extended beyond the time that the trumpets were sounding, it would seem that yes, you have fulfilled your obligation. This, however, is difficult. Come and hear that which was taught in a Mishnah. If one blew the initial tekiah, a long continuous shofar blast of the first tekiah, teruah, tekiah set, and then drew out the final tekiah of that set, so that it spans the length of the two tekiyos, it counts as only one tekiah. And it is not considered two tekiyos, i.e. the final tekiah of the first set and the initial tekiah of the second set. But why is this so? Let it count for him as two tekiyos, since, as stated above, half a blast is considered a full blast. And the Gemara explains, if one hears only the beginning or the end of a shofar blast, he has indeed fulfilled his obligation, but nevertheless, we do not divide a shofar blast into two. So what they're talking about is during Rosh Hashana, where we hear 100 blasts of the shofar, there's a bunch of different combinations of blasts that we hear. Here it's mentioning the tekiah, teruah, tekiah. So it'd be like this. So that's tekiah, teruah, tekiah. Then there's another tekiah, teruah, tekiah right after it. So what they're saying is, if you held the second tekiah of the first set, right, tekiah, teruah, tekiah, and then you held that tekiah, the second tekiah, long, and now you have an incoming obligation to do tekiah, teruah, tekiah again, could you just make one long tekiah to combine the two tekiyahs that sit between tekiah, teruah, tekiah, and that would count as the first tekiah of the next tekiah, teruah, tekiah? And they're saying, no, it would not count. You don't do that. You make sure to make distinct blasts. Each tekiah is its own tekiah, doesn't get combined with another tekiah. Nevertheless, if you only heard part of the tekiah, you have fulfilled your obligation, but it is definitely not optimal. The Gemara raises another difficulty. Come and hear that which was taught in a Mishnah with regard to one who sounds a shofar into a pit or into a cistern or into a large jug. If he clearly heard the sound of the shofar, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if he also heard the sound of an echo, he has not fulfilled his obligation. But why is this so? If half a blast or a partial blast is indeed considered like a complete blast, let him fulfill his obligation with the beginning of the blast, before the echo came back and confused the sound by kind of doubling it. Since the beginning of the blast was heard clearly, right? So if you can imagine, I blow my shofar and there's, a big wall 100 yards away, like a cliff wall, right? And I blow. So at least the beginning of that blast is the simple blast before the echo comes back, and now I have two sounds out of phase confusing each other, which would render it unfit for fulfilling my obligation to hear the shofar. But since I heard part of it before the echo came back, haven't I fulfilled my obligation? That's what the Gemara is asking. Rather, we must retreat from the explanation offered above, and rather say as follows: two sounds coming from one source or person cannot be discerned. This was the miracle of Mount Sinai, in which the people heard both remember the Shabbos and keep the Shabbos. So that's interesting that people heard it. So I guess I'm remembering wrong. I thought that the people only heard the first two commandments, and then they said, stop, it's too much for us. But at any rate, where am I? So the people heard, or at least Moses heard for sure, the miracle at Sinai, in which remember the Shabbos and keep the Shabbos, which came from the voice of God, and even though they were being said at the same time, were both clearly discernible, and that was part of the miracle. But the sounds of two different sources or people can be properly discerned. So this is interesting. Here they're saying that two people speaking together, we can hear the two words that they're saying. If two people speak one word at the same time, a different word, we will be able to figure out both of them what they said. But if somehow one person is able to utter two sounds at the same time, that will be too confusing. Now, that is possible. For example, one person can blow two shofars, but that won't be permissible for fulfilling one's obligation on Rosh Hashana. It might sound cool, but it won't fulfill the obligation on Rosh Hashana. What about if two people blow shofars? What about that? Let's see. So the Gemara raises another difficulty. But is it really true that two sounds coming from two different people can be properly discerned? Isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to the public reading of the Torah? One person may read and one may translate, provided that there are not two people reading and two people translating. Consequently, it is clear that two sounds cannot be properly heard even when they come from two different people. Now, this is interesting. When we have public Torah reading, like we have every Shabbat and on Mondays and Thursdays morning services and on every holiday when there's a Torah reading, there's one person reading from the Torah. Now, if two people were reading at the same time, in sync, right? I mean, that's not that difficult. You see that all the time in elementary school. The kids are reading aloud together, and we can hear the words that they're saying because they're all reading the same words at the same time. But for fulfilling one's obligation to hear a Torah read publicly, no, that is not permissible. We don't have two people reading the Torah at the same time in terms of publicly addressing the congregation. And the Gemara answers, this is not difficult since our case is only similar to the case mentioned in the latter clause of the baraisa that you've just brought, which reads, with regard to the reading of Hallel, right? The Psalms that we read actually this morning in synagogue because it's Rosh Chodesh and we recite Hallel, the Psalms 113 through 118. Sometimes they're recited, often they're sung. It's very beautiful. And if people are singing together, or even if they're just speaking it aloud together, yes, we have recited Hallel and we have fulfilled our obligation. Likewise, on Purim, if we are reciting the scroll of Esther and two people are reading it aloud together and synchronized, yes, the people listening have fulfilled their obligation. Even 10 people may read simultaneously. Apparently, since these readings are dear to their listeners, they direct their attention to them and they listen attentively and they distinguish between the different readers. Here too, since the sounding of the shofar is dear to the listener, he directs his attention to the matter and he discerns between the two sounds. In this case, we're talking about the shofar sounding at the same time as the trumpets. The Gemara asks, but if it is indeed possible to discern the sound of the shofar, even when it is sounded simultaneously with the trumpets, why does he sound a long blast with the shofar? The Gemara, if indeed, I mean, it's true that when you're listening to an orchestra, or let's say a combo, of 5 instruments, just one person playing each of the 5 instruments, if you listen closely, you can make out the drum, you could make out the trumpet, you could make out the violin, you could make out the cello, you could hear one instrument at a time if you listen closely. If so, why does the shofar need a long blast so that it keeps playing after the trumpets have stopped? If you could discern the shofar even when it's being accompanied by trumpets, why do you need the long blast? And the Gemara answers, this is so that the people should know and understand that the mitzvah of the day is specifically with the shofar. The trumpets sounding alongside it are giving kavod, are giving honor to the shofar, like sort of elevating its status, but the mitzvah, the commandment, is to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana and on Yom Kippur. It was taught in the Mishna, the shofarot that were used on public fast days were made from the curved horns of rams and their mouths were plated with silver. And the Gemara asks, what is different there that the shofar of Rosh Hashana is plated with gold? And what is different here that the shofarot of fast days are plated with silver? And the Gemara answers, if you wish, you can say, any shofar made for the purpose of gathering people together is made of silver. As it is written, make for yourself 2 trumpets of silver Of a whole piece shall you make them, and you shall use them for calling the assembly and for the journeying of the camps. As I mentioned, that's Numbers 10:2. As I mentioned earlier, there were 2 silver trumpets that were used to communicate to the 2 million people, the children of Israel, wandering in the desert after the exodus from Egypt. And the signals for, okay, get up, it's time to march, we're heading out, was with 2 silver trumpets. And that's why on public fast days, they would use silver trumpets, and the shofar that accompanied those silver trumpets would be plated with silver. That's why it was silver. And if you wish, you could say, the Torah spared the money of the Jewish people, and therefore allows these shofarot to be made of silver, which is less costly than gold. And the Gemara asks, if so, there too, the shofar of Rosh Hashana should be made with silver plating. If the Torah spares the money of the Jewish people, it doesn't lead us to incur unnecessary expense, then why are we making gold-plated shofars for Rosh Hashana? And the Gemara answers, even so, the duty of honoring the festival is given priority so that it is proper to beautify the shofar of Rosh Hashana, unlike the shofars used on public fast days. On the fast day, however, since it is not a festival, there is no need to use gold, and silver is sufficient. It is related that Rav Papa bar Shmuel thought to act in accordance with the Mishnah regarding all the details of the shofar and the trumpets. But Rava said to him, they said this only with regard to the temple. Right? In other words, Rav Papa bar Shmuel, who I'm pretty sure is in Amora, living and teaching in the Babylonian Jewish community much later than when the temple existed or even after the Mishnah was put together, he thought to, when they were observing Rosh Hashana in their community, to have silver trumpets along with the shofar. But Rava said to him, they said this only with regard to the temple. And this is also taught in a Baraisa. In what case is this statement said that the shofar is accompanied by silver trumpets? Only in the temple. But in the provinces, anywhere outside the temple, even when the temple was standing, the law is as follows. Wherever there are trumpets, for example, on fast days, there is no shofar. And wherever there's a shofar, for example, on Rosh Hashana, there are no trumpets. Using both together was only at the temple when the temple was standing. And we're going to skip down to the bottom of the A side of page 27 and read Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3. A shofar that was cracked and then glued together, even though it appears to be whole, is unfit. Similarly, if one glued together broken fragments of shofarot to form a complete shofar, the shofar is unfit. Pasul, unfit. If the shofar was punctured and the puncture was sealed, if it impedes the blowing, the shofar is unfit. But if not, it had a puncture and then you fix the puncture and it doesn't impede the sound of the shofar, then that shofar is fit. If one sounds a shofar into a pit or into a cistern or into a large jug, if he clearly heard the sound of the shofar, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if he heard the sound of an echo, he has not fulfilled his obligation. We just mentioned this Mishnah during the previous discussion of the earlier Mishnah. And similarly, if one was passing behind a synagogue or his house was adjacent to the synagogue and he heard the sound of the shofar or the sound of the scroll of Esther being read during Purim, if this person focused his heart, i.e. his intent, to fulfill his obligation, then he fulfilled his obligation. But if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. In other words, on Rosh Hashana, when you hear the shofar, you have to have an intent to hear the shofar in order to fulfill your obligation of hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashana. If you just happen to be walking past the synagogue while they were blowing the shofar, and then, after it was over, you're like, oh, I heard the shofar. Okay, cool. I'm done. I fulfill my obligation. Then you haven't fulfilled your obligation. But If while you're walking past the synagogue, you hear that they're blowing the shofar and you're like, oh my gosh, they're blowing the shofar. I forgot that today's Rosh Hashana. Let me listen closely. And you hear the shofar with full intent, then you have fulfilled your obligation. It is therefore possible for two people to hear the shofar blasts, but only one of them fulfills his obligation, even though this one heard and also the other one heard. Nevertheless, this one focused his heart to fulfill his obligation, and he has therefore indeed fulfilled it, but the other one did not focus his heart, and so he has not fulfilled his obligation. That is Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 3. Now we begin the Gemara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shach, kol nihi b'dira. Okay. The sages taught in a baraisa, if a shofar was long and it was shortened, it is still fit. Right? If you had a shofar like this and you cut off the end like that, and now it's a much shorter shofar, it's still a qualified shofar. If the shofar, if it was scraped out so that only its outer layer remains, right? You can see the thickness of the shofar. So if I scraped out the inside and left the outer layer and it was very thin, so that only its outer layer remains, it is also fit. If the shofar was plated with gold at the place where one puts his mouth, it is unfit. If I put gold right over the end here. At the place where one puts his mouth, it is unfit. If it was plated not at the place where he puts his mouth, then it is fit. I could make strips of gold or silver around the shofar, that's okay. If it was plated with gold on the inside, if I coated the inside of the shofar with gold leaf, for example, it is unfit. As in that case, one does not hear the sound of a shofar, but rather the sound of a golden instrument. If, however, it was plated with gold on the outside, the following distinction applies. If its sound changed from what it was before the plating, it is unfit. But if not, the gold plating is mere ornamentation, and it is therefore fit. It was taught in the Mishna, if one glued together broken fragments of shofarot, shofarot is a plural of shofar, to form a complete shofar, the shofar is unfit. And the sages taught in a baraisa, if anything was added to a shofar, whether of the same substance, i.e. horn, or of a foreign substance, the shofar is unfit. If the shofar was punctured and sealed, whether with the same substance or with a foreign substance, it is unfit. Now, didn't it just say that if it was punctured and sealed, it is fit? Rabbi Nassan says, if it was sealed with the same substance, it is fit. If it is sealed with a foreign substance, it is unfit. Now that we had a contradiction, and let's just read the halacha on this. Punctured and sealed. A shofar that was punctured and was not sealed is fit for performing the mitzvah, even though its sound is altered. So if it has an extra hole on the side, it's still fit. However, it should not be used ab initio, as some authorities hold that it is unfit. It might be fit, but it is certainly not an optimal shofar, and you want the best possible shofar in Rosh Hashana. And some authorities even say the fact that it has a hole in the side renders it unfit. So just to be on the safe side, you shouldn't use such a shofar to fulfill one's obligation on Rosh Hashana. If one sealed the shofar with shofar material, it is fit, as long as most of the original shofar remains and the seal restored the original sound of the shofar and does not obstruct it. However, if one sealed the shofar with a foreign substance, it is disqualified, and this is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Natan, according to Rabbi Yochanan's first, more stringent explanation of this law in the Gemara. Let's continue. The Baraisa stated, if it was sealed with the same substance, it is fit. Concerning this, Rabbi Yochanan said, this applies only where most of the original shofar is intact and only a small patch was added. And the Gemara includes, by inference, if it was sealed with a foreign substance, then even if most of the original shofar is intact, nevertheless, it is unfit. Some teach this ruling with regard to the last clause of the Baraisa, in which it was taught, if it was sealed with a foreign substance, it is unfit. And concerning this, Rabbi Yochanan said, this is only where most of the original shofar was missing, so that the patch constitutes the majority. And the Gemara concludes, by inference, if it was sealed with the same substance, then even if most of the original shofar was missing, it is still fit. The Baraisa continues, if the shofar was plated with gold on the inside, it is unfit. If, however, it was plated on the outside, and if its sound changed from what it was before the plating, the gold plating, it is unfit. But if the sound was not changed, it is fit. If the shofar was cracked lengthwise, if you had a crack running along the length of the shofar, it is unfit. But if it was cracked along its width, the following distinction applies. If the portion above the crack there remains a measure sufficient to sound a blast, it is fit, but if not, it is unfit. And how much is a measure sufficient to sound a blast? And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel explained, enough that when he holds it in his hand, it can be seen protruding on one side of his hand and on the other side, right? So how much shofar do you need to have a kosher shofar? Enough so that when you hold it in your hand, some sticks out on this side and some sticks out on that side. So if I cut this shofar here and I only had this part of it, it would still be a kosher shofar. If the sound of the shofar is high or deep or dry, it is fit for blowing, as the Torah does not require a particular sound, and all sounds coming from a shofar are fit. I'm almost done, so if you have comments or questions, please get them in. It is related that the following ruling was sent from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, to the father of Shmuel, the sage living in Babylonia. If one drilled out the inside of a horn and blew it, he has fulfilled his obligation. And the Gemara asks, it is obvious, for all shofarot are drilled, since after the horn is removed from the animal, the bone that fills the horn and connects it to the animal's head must be removed. What then does this ruling teach us? And Rav Ashi said, here we are discussing a case where he drilled the bone that fills the horn instead of removing it in the usual manner. And lest you say that even something made of the same substance interposes, and the sound that is produced is emitted from the bone and not from the shofar, the ruling therefore teaches us that since the bone and the horn are considered to be the same substance, the shofar is fit and he has fulfilled his obligation. Right? When we get a shofar, we purchase a shofar from a reputable shofar dealer. It's been prepared for us, right? So the place where this attached to the animal, there was bone here. There was the bone of the sheep, of the ram that went into this, and that was cut off when the animal was slaughtered, and then that bone is removed. But if some of that bone remained in the shofar and then they drilled through the bone so that the sound could come out, it would still be a kosher shofar because the bone of the sheep and its horn it's obviously a different substance, but for the purpose of the shofar, it's considered to be one thing, and it wouldn't render it unfit to have some of that bone left over. All right, that's what I've got today. Let us go to questions and comments. Bill, I think it's actually going off, oddly enough, the Septuagint numbering, which does have Shabbos as the fifth commandment, which, if so, is odd. Why use the Septuagint instead of the Masoretic text for this? That's just a weird choice. Exactly. We agree. I'm not sure what they were thinking. I actually think it's a misprint in the Koran, because I do understand that in non-Jewish Bibles, the Ten Commandments are numbered a little bit differently. But, the standard Jewish way is that the fifth commandment is honor your parents and the fourth commandment is Shabbos. Tom, must one hear all 100 blasts to fulfill her obligation? I'm not sure. We haven't covered that, right? So what we covered today is that if you heard only part of one blast, it's as if you heard that whole blast. The Torah just says, that you have to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana. You shall blast the shofar. You shall blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana. From where is it derived that we have to hear 100 blasts of the shofar? I don't remember from the last time I went through this tractate, but I'm guessing that we're going to encounter that law, and that derivation, and that teaching in these final 8 pages that still lie ahead of us. I'm sure, since we're talking so much about the shofar and the blasts of Rosh Hashanah, and we have 100 blasts, they're going to tell us why, from where we get that requirement, why we have to hear 100 blasts, and where that's derived from. I'm guessing. So stay tuned. Ifa, and then, that you're supposed to hear 100, and then your question, have you fulfilled your obligation if you don't hear all 100? Let's find out. Now, it happened that I brought my shofar with me to Uman when I went there to celebrate Rosh Hashana, Uman in Ukraine. And I blew it in the airport because when we're on the way there, it's before Rosh Hashana, it's Elul, we blast the shofar every day. And it was super fun, just blowing it in the airports, blowing it in the car, blowing it around Ukraine, blowing it in the place where we were staying in Uman. And it was just fun, like getting into the Rosh Hashanah spirit, as it were. But then it happened that somebody, I don't know what happened, his plane came late, or he arrived late, or he was incapacitated, and he didn't hear the shofar blasts that were blown in the congregation. And then he arrived later, and somebody said, can somebody blow the shofar for this guy? I said, I'd be happy to blow the shofar for this guy. So then they said, okay, let's do it. And then somebody started calling it out for me, and I realized, what he means is, this guy needs to hear all 100 blasts. Now, the 100 blasts that we hear on Rosh Hashanah are spread out over several hours. I, endeavored to blast the shofar all 100 times, in a row for this guy. And I did well up until like maybe the 60s or 70s. Then my lips just started giving out. I was trying, and I was just not producing a proper sound. And at that point, somebody stepped up and helped me so that we could get all 100 for this guy. Ifa. Interestingly, a blind girl I knew could listen to 2 different things at once, just as normally sighted people could listen to one source and see at the same time. So the enhanced senses, right, of somebody who is blind, their hearing gets so much more acute. Just like somebody who is deaf, their vision maybe gets more acute. So that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing, Ifa. Tom, even if you're in synagogue, don't you still have to hear it with intent? Yes. Now, someone might say, well, I came to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. I have clearly, demonstrated my intent to hear the shofar today. But, our rabbi always says, okay, here come the shofar blast. Make sure that you are listening with the intent to fulfill your obligation. And finally, Tom, what if truncating it changes its sound after cutting the shofar? I mean, it will change the sound, but it will still be a shofar sound. I think that's what we're getting at. Cutting it is not a problem, right? Cutting it just means you're making a shorter shofar. Damaging it with a crack or a hole in the side, that's where you might have an unfit shofar, and part of the test of that is whether the sound was altered or not. That's my sense of what we're reading here. Okay, That's it for today. With God's help, we'll be together tomorrow. Be together again tomorrow night, Saturday night after Shabbos. I think Shabbos is ending now about 6:30. I will try to, get on the air by 7:15. Right? Am I mistaken here, or is that next week? At any rate, I usually can get on the air about 45 minutes after Shabbat ends here in Los Angeles, so that'll be tomorrow night. And then tomorrow night when we go to bed, we set our clocks back an hour, and that's the new schedule on Sunday. And so next Friday, Shabbat's going to start really early and end early on next Saturday night. Good Shabbos, good Hodesh. You should have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful Kislev, the month of miracles.